All right, episode number 2 of the Vancouver Special Podcast, where we talk about real estate in our city and how it connects to our interpersonal and social lives. I'm Hasan Juma with Oakwyn Realty.
And I'm Michelle Legaspi, also with Oakwyn Realty. And today's episode, we are discussing investment properties. So right off the bat, being able to say something like, I've got an investment property, that's a flex.
Absolutely.
So it's, something that might get you a right swipe on the dating apps or...
I probably wouldn't lead with that, though, because you want people to have good intentions.
Leave a little bit of mystery.
Yeah, leave some mystery there.
Okay, save it for the second date.
That's right. If you notice that she's ghosting or fading, that's when you got to kind of drop it in there.
Like, but I have an investment property.
Wait.
Yeah. So one of the things that clients always ask me is, Michelle, this is something that I should be worth exploring. So that's something that we'll talk about today, whether or not the juice is worth the squeeze. Yeah. Hasan, right off the bat, are there some real estate investing 101 facts that you feel like people need to know?
Yeah, 100%. So I'll preface this as well by saying that a lot of people nowadays are a little bit more hesitant when it comes to rental investing and rental condo investing. Has to do with some of our rental laws here in BC, rent control, for instance. So there's a lot of talk out there that, like you mentioned, is it actually worth the squeeze? If you looked at it, several years ago, rental investing was a very natural thing to do as people progressed through real estate.
Yep.
A lot more kind of things to consider. Mm-hmm. And then also, like this show, we're likely to talk a lot more on the condo side. Yep. There's a lot of people out there that'll say you should never invest in condos. I hear this quite a bit. Just before I get into the 101s, just keep in mind, if you do hear that sort of sentiment, generally this is coming from people that already own multi-million dollars worth of real estate,
who have that equity to pull from.
Yeah. So just always when you're kind of picking up information on investing, real estate investing, always consider the source. Like,
do
they're
your
lucky,
own homework.
Yeah. They're lucky to have more time in the business, more time in the game. And so this is more angled towards, maybe you own your primary residence right now. You're thinking about what your next step is. Maybe you already have one rental. You're thinking about a second. So keeping that in mind, in terms of investing 101 and especially rental investing, time in the market is everything. Rental is not a short-term game in any way. You're not buying a property, fixing it up, flipping it quickly. You really have to have, in my opinion, at least a 10-year horizon, I would say.
I mean, it's comparable to other investments where you put your money in the bank, you kind of got to let it sit because time and compound interest is your best friend. It's the same thing with property.
Yeah, exactly. And you know what? We'll touch on that a little bit as well when we talk later on about, should you do rental property investment versus maybe stock market, that sort of thing. But I think in terms of like 101, getting rolling, it's a long-term investment. And so when you are purchasing a rental property, you really want to focus on the location and how that location
100%.
Looks today and where it's going to be in the future. It's probably, the most important thing is that area going to grow? And if that area is going to grow, only then will your capital grow.
Yeah.
Right? I think location. You hear it in real estate.
Number one thing when it comes to investments.
I was just going to say, I think it's more important for investment than even as your principal residence.
Yeah,
right.
Sure.
You can make more sacrifices on the principal residence side. Do you think so?
Yes. There's a little bit more emotion involved when you're buying into a principal residence because it's something that you're going to spend a lot of time in versus when we're going into investments. I always suggest to take as much emotion out of it. Just look at the numbers, look at the location, the hard facts, the hard data, because that's what's going to translate into dollars.
Yeah. And it brings up also a good point in the sense that what I find with a lot of newer investors, rental condo investors, is they still have their principal residence hat on in the sense that when it comes to, okay, I don't want to invest in this area because
I wouldn't live there.
I wouldn't live there. It's grimy still, like whatever it might be. You hear a lot of that. And I think that's probably one of the challenges for first-time investors to take themselves out of it and actually have a long-term, picture of that property, right? Because, there's so many different cities you can put your money in, obviously, in the Lower Mainland. And generally speaking, the ones that we normally would think about, like very close to the city, downtown, Vancouver, appreciation-wise, in the last 5 to 10 years, they have not appreciated like places in the east, in the Fraser Valley, right? So thinking outside the box in terms of location and making sure you're picking growth locations. What about like down payments?
So as an investment property, if you're declaring your purchase as an investment property, the minimum down payment is 20%. Now,
do you think that's enough?
That was going to be my question, because most of my clients, when we break the numbers down, I tell them if you're not putting at least 50% down, the numbers don't make sense.
Yeah.
And that's at a minimum. I would suggest between like 60 to 80.
Yeah, and it sounds like a wild amount. I think there's two schools of thought. Like 20%, definitely anywhere in the Lower Mainland, Fraser Valley, you're feeding that property. And when we say
we're talking
feeding,
thousands of dollars out of pocket.
And some people are okay doing that to a certain extent. So you'll want to assess your own situation in terms of two things, right? Like if I put in 30%, 40%, 50%, what is my opportunity cost with that capital? What's
Correct.
my other thing that I can do with this capital, and what's the return I can get versus putting in a little bit less and maybe feeding that property? Because I have clients for sure that are like, no, I'll just put less. I don't mind feeding it. I'll take my capital appreciation each year. That will outweigh the amount that I'm feeding it. And generally they have more longer term goals with the real estate. I agree with you though that more is better for most people if they can do it.
Yeah, if you can do it 100%, it just gives you that extra peace of mind too, for those long-term goals. And also as far as goals go, the other thing that I like to highlight is whether or not we're focusing on equity earnings or if you want cash flow, because you can't have both, at least not in Metro Vancouver.
Yeah.
Do you find that?
Yeah. Do you find most people are looking for cash flow or for equity? Like, how is it in your world?
Most first-time investors will come to me and be like, Michelle, I want both. And then I have to burst their bubble. And then I'll have to be like, well, you know what? It's really hard to get that cash flow space. So let's look for the equity. Let's find that, just about to turn location, a great building that's well managed where the numbers make sense.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that's my advice to them, because as far as cash flow, it's really, really hard to find. Super
hard. I find most people ask me for cash flow. Like everyone that talks to me about rental investments, they strictly want cash flow, and it's a challenging conversation because a lot of times they are considering minimum down payments. So, again, what I would suggest is if you are looking for cash flow, a couple things, you're going to need to boost your down payment 100%, and you're going to have to look into other areas, maybe even outside of the Lower Mainland, outside of the Fraser Valley. Like I think depending on how much you put down, like some Chilliwack 2-bedrooms where the rental rates are, I think you can get close. Like I think the goal now is to
net break even.
Yeah, well, I was just going to say, I think the goal now is to try and break even. Maybe you're paying a couple $100 a month. The reality is I have a couple rentals that will be coming up in pre-sale. One at the end of this year, one next year, and I'm planning to feed them. Like I know that I'm going to have to feed them.
Yeah.
Even though, the rental assessment we got done on it has gone up considerably since we bought it in pre-sale.
Yeah.
Still going to have to feed it.
Yeah.
We're going to have to make more money. Rates are going to have to come down, hopefully. But, that's something you do need to keep in mind. So when you're purchasing, so far we've talked about location.
Yes.
Being very important. Your down payment, of course. Next is, making a decision between how do you want to find your tenant and how do you want to manage that, whether you want to do it on your own or whether you want to hire a property manager. Michelle, what do you think?
Always hire a property manager. It's worth every dollar, in my opinion. It's something that you have to consider in your net sheet, which is another thing for people to consider. Is when you really break down your numbers, it helps make you make those decisions.
How would you explain a net sheet to someone who's listening who hasn't maybe seen one of those yet?
Yeah, so basically you look at your purchase price, your cost of borrowing if you are putting a mortgage on there, your down payment, your property taxes, your potential income from your rent, strata fees, miscellaneous repair costs.
Sounds like a lot of expenses there, Michelle. You're scaring everyone away.
It's a few line items.
Yeah.
Closing costs also for your purchase you have to take into consideration, and then carry that out in something that is called a pro forma. And where that just breaks everything down and whittles it down to a percentage of whether or not you will be making money on that or not.
Yeah. So you suggest like property manager for sure. Like typically what you'll find with a property manager when, Michelle's talking about a net sheet, of course it's going to cost you some money. I'm usually seeing anywhere from 8 to 10% as a property management fee of the rent.
10%'s the norm now.
So the inflation,
8%'s a couple of years ago.
Yeah. And then often they will also, they'll charge you a placement fee as well, like 40 or 50% of the first month's rent. Yeah. So something to consider, I think for myself, like I have some clients that are like, no, I'm going to do it on my own. Yep. I can do it. Sometimes with a newer condo, sometimes it can be a little bit easier. You knock on wood, you don't have as many surprises necessarily happening with a condo that's still under warranty. So that's something to consider. For my clients that are like, no, I'm gung-ho, I'm going to do it myself. That's cool. And then I have some clients that start out that way.
Yeah.
And then they're like, no, even before they get a tenant in there, they realize their world is too busy to take it on themselves.
Yes.
But I think I'm the same where you budget in for it. Again, if you want to do it on your own, that's great. A lot of great property managers out there that will take the decision making, will take that, all the responsibility away from you.
You just let them know what your goals are. And then they're like, okay, got it. We'll take it from here. And I find that for most people, once they do see the appeal of getting the property manager, they're like, yeah, I'm never going back.
Yeah. I think it's probably hard to go back. Right?
Yes.
Like when you don't have to deal with the rental at all.
Yes.
Going back the other way is probably difficult.
Yeah.
Obviously making the switch from managing it on your own to a property manager, that feels good, of course. You don't have to deal with it.
Part of tenant screening is like, you got to do a credit check. Are you asking about their job history? Are you calling the references? It's kind of like a mini job interview.
Yeah.
And then you're trying to meet them in person, see what they're like, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's one less thing for you to deal with. And I mean, for people like you and I, where we're always running around like headless chickens and wish we had 5 clones of ourselves, it's worth every penny.
Yeah. Just don't have like the time energy for it. And really that's what it is. It's the investment in time. Generally you will purchase a rental condo because you don't want to put a ton of time into it. It's a type of investment where, it's more of a set it and forget it, right? It's not passive. There's nothing out there that's truly, truly passive, but you can make a rental condo almost passive, very close. Yeah. Again, it is going to eat into your bottom line, but if you're looking for an investment for the long term that you don't have to do much with, then I think rental condo investment is definitely the way to go. So we talked about tenant screening. We talked about net sheets. Maybe we'll touch a little bit on the Residential Tenancy Act. And
Big one.
Yeah, and I touched on it earlier how, that does detract a lot of people based on our rental laws and having rent control here in BC.
There's a lot of lines for you to have to color within.
Yeah, and it's pretty restrictive, right? And a lot of areas across Canada do have the rent controls. Alberta does not. And what we've been seeing is, quite a lot of investors have been shifting their, rental portfolio to Alberta. But I just heard the other day that they're starting to talk about rent controls because when it comes to rental rates, Alberta has actually had the strongest year-over-year gain. So no one is going to be, how do I say this? No one's going to be safe from rent controls. And so it's just something that you're going to have to deal with as a rental investor. On that note, if you purchase a property and a tenant is already in it, you're purchasing a rental property, how does that work?
You are inheriting the tenant and their tenancy agreement, their rental rate, the date that they signed it, which will correlate to when you're allowed to do rental increases, any notices, and all that stuff that's related to the rental tenancy agreement. So that's also something that people need to keep in mind, that if you are looking for an investment property, typically the goal is to buy a unit that's vacant so that you can start from scratch rather than inherit the tenant who's in there. Because also you didn't do the screening, so maybe the previous landlord didn't have the same standards as you or requirements. So yeah, something to consider.
Yeah, and good point in terms of vacant properties. So the value of a vacant property to investor is massive.
100%.
And so, you know, I've worked with clients where we're looking at, for example, multifamily buildings, and maybe there's like 6 or 7 like rental units in there. And many times you will have tenants on there that are on some very old rental rates. And when you're looking at rentals in that capacity, where you're looking at maybe more than 1 or 2 units, you're really looking at that net return.
Yeah.
And, you know, if it doesn't shake out because a lot of the rents are older rents, that basically, you know, kills the deal essentially. So if you come across properties that are vacant, I think those are excellent ones to go for. You can come across properties where they are at, you know, market rents already, where there may be a tenant in there. Or, of course, if it is right now owner occupied.
Yes.
Right? Because that owner is going to leave. It gives you the flexibility to place your own tenant. And you brought up a good point where, you know, being able to choose your tenant, also very important.
Yeah.
Right? Because when you have a tenant, it's marriage.
Yes.
It's love.
Yeah. Well,
it's not love.
Ideally, but magic wand. That's how we all want it to be.
It's almost, you're more committed to the tenant than you are to like a wife or a husband. Like,
yes,
like
you want to keep the tenant happy because you don't want them to trash your place.
Like you can divorce your spouse. Like you can't
divorce your tenants because of the rental tenancy agreement.
It's very hard, and even when things go a little bit sideways, it's always a process to have the tenant to be able to break that relationship, going to the residential tenancy board, etc. So you know, the key is you try and find a property that is vacant or owner occupied or is already paying market rents, and you work around our Residential Tenancy Act. It's just how it is. It's how it is here. It's how it is in other provinces.
Know it, love it.
Yeah, and
live
then,
it.
Yeah, and then you might not love it, but also that comes back to, you know, hiring a good property manager that knows what's going on, because
they live, breathe, and eat the rental tenancy agreement.
And then you don't need to like fully grasp it or fully understand it. Now, do keep in mind, you know, if you're purchasing a property for investment, you want to rent it out. The licensing here in BC is different for real estate agents that buy and sell real estate and manage property.
Renting, yes.
Yeah, so you may have like a favorite realtor you work with. You do want to find out, you know, do you have the correct licensing to be able to manage this for me? Oftentimes, agents don't have both. So that's something to consider as well.
Do you have your?
No, I do not.
Okay.
I don't do it. I just focus on buying and selling. Yep. But what we are able to do is point you towards resources.
Happy to refer you out.
Right?
Yeah.
Yeah. And we know good property managers that we can, you know, connect you with or whatnot.
Yeah. And then I think also, just as far as tips go for clients looking into this, touching on what you said about buying something that's owner occupied, a fun thing that you can do is, well, we write this into our contracts. We allow visits prior to completion.
Yes.
And during those visits, we actually get a head start on tenant screening and tenant visits. So we'll advise our clients to, you know, put the ad up. We'll ask the listing agent permission to use the pictures on like Craigslist or whatever if they are going to self-manage. And then we'll just be like, hey, we're going to use one of our visits to have potential tenants come in and take a look. And then so by the time you complete and you're like starting whatever payments you're making, you hopefully already have a tenancy agreement right off the bat, so you don't have any lost dollars due to time.
Such a good point. I don't want to like sidetrack this thing, but I had a disaster happen last year that involves exactly this. So I had a client who purchased a condo for investing, for rental investing, wanted to do the same thing. We were completing at, I think it was like November 20th. So we want to get a tenant in there for December 1st. I put the clause in there for visits. Other agent was super cool. He's like, you can go anytime you want. Here's a set of keys. I show up after subject removal before completion.
Oh, no.
I get to the floor of the unit of my client's condo, and I'm there to meet a tenant and my client who are coming 5 minutes later. I'm just there to turn on the lights. I hop off the elevator. I hear the sounds of those industrial fans.
Oh, no.
I hop out the elevator. There's industrial fans that are basically drying up flood damage everywhere.
Oh, God.
I'm like, what is going on? So I'm still not cluing in. I'm kind of like, okay, it just, the hallway
It might not be
up.
us.
Might not be us. I go around the corner. There is one of the industrial fans pointed right at the door of this unit. I'm like, oh my God.
Damn it.
Oh my God. My client's coming in 5 minutes with a tenant to look at the property. I open the door. No joke. There's like 10 or 12 industrial fans all up in the unit.
What happened?
But nothing was touched yet. So apparently what happened, this is a brand new building. There was a major flood that started from one of the main water elbow joints on that floor, and it affected like 10 floors below it. Luckily, my client no-showed, and so did the tenant. The tenant had canceled. I've never been happy to have a client no-show. I was so thankful.
Yeah.
But anyways, long story short.
They're like, oh, sorry, couldn't make it. You're like, no problem. See you in 2 weeks.
Yeah. And so ultimately, I want to wrap this up. What ultimately happened, obviously, my clients came on a later date. They were freaked out. 3 days before completion, I'm told that the fans are going to be out. Everything's good. I walk in. All the floors are ripped out. This is Monday. Completion's on Thursday. There's no floors. I'm like, okay, we're going to have to figure this out. And how it works in contractual laws, just so you know, is that the property has to be in substantially the same condition on
as
completion.
when you saw it.
On completion.
Yes.
So we had to give them until completion, even though there was no floors.
Yes.
I suggested hold back all this sort of stuff. Long story short, we walk in on completion. It's good. So it's a great clause to have. But there's a part of me that's like, if I didn't put that clause in there,
what would you have walked into?
The unit would have looked identical.
You wouldn't have known.
We wouldn't even have known. So did I cause my client undue stress with all of that in trying to help him? But long story short, we did rent it out for December 1st.
Oh, okay.
Either way. So I still
happy
believe
ending
in
to that
clause.
story.
Yes. Sorry to sidetrack this, but that's like fresh on my mind. But I love that clause. And not a lot of agents are using it.
And
right?
not a lot of people know that you can do that, because for the most part, especially when you're buying an investment property, like I mentioned, my suggestion is always to take the emotion out of it. So you're kind of just like, okay, looking, it's clean, like everything is working, like done. You're in and out in 5 minutes. And so you don't necessarily get a really ingrained mental picture of the property you're buying. So the visits do help for sure.
Yeah, that's so true. Like you're making real estate buying decisions after 10, 15 minutes in the property. Sometimes you're walking in and like the tenant's in there while you're showing the property.
Yeah.
And so you're in even quicker because like you're walking through all their stuff and they're kind of following you around, etc. So it's good to, have those visits and then, timing it up so that you can get a tenant in there quickly because of the carrying costs and the holding costs if you don't get a tenant in there.
Yes.
I will say that, one of the reasons you would choose to invest in a rental condo is the chances of you not having a tenant in there anywhere in Canada very low.
Yeah, what's the vacancy rate?
Yeah, vacancy rate in Canada and Vancouver for condos 0.9%.
That's so low.
So it's extremely low. And that's why they say real estate's one of the safest investments because you're very unlikely to not have some level of income coming into the property. Some detractors will also say, okay, well, why would you buy a rental condo when you can just put the money into the S&P 500?
Yeah,
put it into
stocks. Buy a 10-year bond.
Yeah, well, and that's the thing. Like, I think the big thing is there are so many things you can do with your money, but you're very unlikely to be disciplined enough to do it.
Yes.
Right? So, like, what I love about real estate is, for me, it's an illiquid asset that has liquidity.
Yes.
Meaning that you're not going to wake up one morning and be like, oh my God, they got rid of the bus line that was running right there that was perfect for tenants. I'm going to sell this property tonight. I'm done with it. You can't do that. You have more time to make decisions in real estate. Whereas if you put that money in the stock market, you can wake up that morning and you don't like something the CEO said, you can sell it right away. And in fact, making quick, rash decisions are what get in the way of your gains.
Yeah.
Right. And so when I say that there is some liquidity to Vancouver real estate, would you agree with me that for the right price, every property is sellable?
Oh, 100%. I mean, and that just goes back to the basics of supply and demand.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's like, especially I think in Vancouver. So it's like, if you do need to sell your piece of real estate, you can do it, but you have all of these opportunities to change your mind. And sometimes the best thing you can do with condo investing is convince yourself not to sell when prices, go down or they go
to ride
up
the
or
wave.
whatnot.
I mean, that was like the last couple of years with the stock market. I don't know about you, but I kept looking at my portfolio and I was like, I need to stop doing this because it's just making me depressed.
Yeah, I stopped looking.
Yeah. And then just being like, okay, do I keep contributing? Like, do I stop? And then just thinking about that, I'm like, no, I'm in it for the long game. It's sitting in my RRSPs. I'm just going to ride it out. And so it's kind of the same thing where your real estate portfolio will go through the highs and lows. And if you're diligent and determined enough to really play the long game, then you'll potentially make the most gains out of everybody else who's like getting distracted by all the news that they hear.
Yeah. And if you have obviously like a fixed rate mortgage, like don't do what I did and take out 2 variable rate mortgages right when rates are going to climb through the roof. But if you have a fixed rate, whether your real estate's coming down or it's going up, you know what you're paying.
You can project, which is really nice.
And also with stocks, it's like the best times to buy them, if you still believe in that company, is when they're going down.
Yeah.
But like psychologically, that's it's a very hard thing to do. And it's also very hard to buy a stock for $100, watch it go down to like 50 or $40 and then watch it go back up. Most people say they can do it, but most people will sell it at $70 or 65 because they just can't stomach it.
Yeah.
And with real estate, you're kind of forced to stomach it.
Yeah. And I mean, like, let's talk briefly about the fluctuation in prices. Like if we're just going through 2020 till now, a lot of people thought the bubble was going to burst, the prices are going to drop, the market's going to crash. But in reality, prices have maybe softened 5 to 6, maybe 7% tops in some areas. But in the grand scheme of things, when you're looking at that graph, the blip is really small.
Yeah. Yeah. And when we talk about like, capital appreciation. So looking back at last year, one of our worst years for like headlines in real estate, definitely one of our worst years for interest rates in real estate, and property prices were up. So condos were up year over year in February, about 5.5%, detached homes about 7% in a bad year. And this also goes to show as well for people that suggest don't rent in condos ever, wait until you can get a detached home. There wasn't a big margin in terms of, or a big gap in terms of how much property went up detached versus condos, number one. And like we mentioned in episode 1, you can't afford to just sit there and wait until you can afford a detached home.
Yeah, because you'll get priced out.
Right? It'll run away from you.
And even when you look at the pro formas of detached homes versus condos, the percentages are very similar. Unless you're really throwing in 100% cash purchase, then of course the numbers are different. But if you've got some cost of borrowing there, the percentage of earnings are very similar. And I feel like getting into the condo market for an investment is a lot more attainable for most people, especially first-time investors.
Yeah, 100%. One thing we didn't talk about previously, but I do want to bring up, important, bylaws. Strata bylaws, right? So for example, you're going to come across some buildings that have age restrictions, 55 plus.
Yep.
You're not going to find rental restrictions anymore. Those are essentially gone outside of short-term rental. But there's some like strata buildings, and I find they're the older buildings. They have the most archaic set of bylaws when it comes to pets. I saw one just recently.
Noise.
Did you see some agent posted on Instagram? You might have seen it too. Normally with pet restrictions, they will say, you can't have certain breeds of dogs. Like some of them will say that.
Yes. They'll make you refer to like the BCSPA list of vicious breeds.
Yeah. So what this one said, the bylaws actually showed the breeds you're allowed.
Oh.
And it was like 15 dogs, like all ankle biter, sorry, but like all like little like yappy.
The yappers.
The yappy dogs, which for me, like, what's having noisy dogs in an apartment is obviously, not a great thing. But, generally speaking, take a look at the bylaws and how they might restrict you,
Yes.
or how they might help you. You want something that's more open.
Yeah, from an investment standpoint, you're going to want the least restrictive set of bylaws, because then that's going to open up your tenant pool a lot more. You're not going to want to, box out people with pets, people with children sometimes. What else?
Yeah, and like on the pets thing, this is a decision as a rental property investor. This is a decision that you'll have to make whether you do want to allow pets. You'll see a lot of rental listings that say, of course, no smoking, no pets. A lot of buildings are no smoking anyways. But on the pet side of things, if you're open to them, you can generally charge a little bit more.
Pet deposit, they call it.
Pet deposit, but even monthly, right? So, for example, I'm purchased a pre-sale that I plan to rent out in Vancouver, and I specifically purchased it on the ground floor with a walkout patio. Because I want to rent it to a pet lover, to someone who has a dog, because,
convenience.
It's convenient for them. They can get out really quickly.
Yeah.
They'll pay a little bit more money for it.
For sure.
Right? To be in a good area. So
I've had clients who have placed tenants in their units for a little bit more of a premium because they were willing to take in somebody with like a pit bull, and because the building allowed it.
Yeah.
So they were able to make a little bit more money that way.
Make sure they have insurance.
Yeah. But speaking about deposits and like pets, on the note of like cleaning, have you ever seen this before where in the tenant agreement, the landlord has put in a mandatory like 1 year professional clean?
Wow. So not to that degree. I've seen some things in Schedule A's for sure. I have not seen, that sounds very like Airbnb-like to me. Like the Airbnb cleaning fee? Really?
No, not necessarily a cleaning fee. It's just the landlord requires that once a year the unit be professionally cleaned.
On whose dollar?
Well, then that's who agrees, right? It's like, do you split it 50-50? Is it the landlord who's like, no, I just want my place to be professionally cleaned once a year. I'll pay for it, no problem.
I think that's great. I would be very open to that.
As a tenant, I'd be like, heck yeah.
Yeah, and as a landlord, I would want to do that because one of the things when you have rental properties, we'll talk about our own experiences, but people generally think like you don't want a noisy landlord or a noisy tenant. And when I say noisy, I mean someone that's like
always
constantly calling you. At the same time, you don't want a quiet tenant.
Yes.
You don't know what's going on in the unit.
It's like a toddler, if it goes quiet in the house, you're like, what's going on?
Yeah, exactly, right? Well, that's what they say about, where did I just read that? They said that if a toddler goes quiet, it's a problem.
Yes.
Like something wrong. Yeah. And are you comparing tenants to toddlers right now? Is that where we're going with this?
Maybe.
No, but I think like, you don't want a tenant that's over, because a lot of tenants will be like, I don't want to bother the landlord. So this is a good point, is like, make sure that the lines of communication are open, especially if you're managing it yourself or with your property manager. Encourage communication between landlord and tenant, because the longer something goes on, the larger of a problem it is.
Yes.
That's a great clause that you brought up there, for sure.
I think it's something to consider. And if the landlord's willing to do it on their dime, like, why not? It's a win-win for everybody.
Yeah. Because you can, per the RTA, you can inspect the unit. I believe it's once a month.
Yes.
I believe it's as frequent as once a month.
You can do the walkthrough.
You give the notice. You can do the walkthrough. Most aren't doing that. I think the cleaning is a nice thing for both sides, making sure upkeep of the unit.
Because you're maintaining your property. You're keeping your tenant happy. Yeah. Everybody wins with that one.
Good.
And then as far as tenant management, again, this is like another reason to go get a property manager. But when you have a nightmare tenant, have you ever had an experience with that?
So I haven't had a nightmare tenant. I had like a negative experience, which I'll talk about. So I had a rental condo, still have it in Coquitlam. And, basically it was like a Friday or a Saturday night. And I get the call that nobody wants to get as a landlord. And I get the call from like the front desk strata manager or whatnot. And they're like, we're trying to get a hold of the occupant in your unit. There's water leaking into the unit below. So
that like nightmare.
11? Yeah, it was at like 11:30 or like midnight, and I'm like, oh my god, what's going on? Trying to get a hold of the tenant, trying to scoot back to the strata manager. I can't get a hold of anyone. I don't know the degree of water that's dropping through. I'm freaking out. Like, as a real estate agent, and we deal with like, condos and water issues. Water issues are the most expensive and obviously the most damaging. And I can't get a hold of the tenant. And I'm like, why am I dealing with this? It was I know it was a night where I was out and about, and I was like, I should not have to deal with this right now.
You're like a Cactus Club. Sorry.
Yeah, like totally ruins the night, right? Because you go back, you're hanging with your friends, and your mind is only on that one thing. And it turns out what happened was my tenants had a toddler, and speaking of toddlers,
see
those toddlers, my tenants had a toddler, and I guess what happened is they had a toy. And they put the toy like right on the drain in the shower. They're playing in the shower. They put the toy there. And so the water
just overflowed
just over the lip of the shower.
Oh,
so
no.
It wasn't terrible, but I guess what happened down below, and this is what happens when water leaks through, is it comes through like the light fixtures.
They're like, why is it raining in here?
Yeah, from the lights, right?
Yeah.
So anyways, long story short, there really was no damage. But at that point I was like, I don't want to get one of those calls again. I don't want to have to deal with it. You know, my personal time is my personal time. I spend enough time on real estate and my business and for my clients that I just don't want to do that. So that was kind of the turning point for me, where I was like, property manager is the way to go.
Yep.
I know you have an investment property, I believe. Any experiences just in regards to yours?
No. And my family's investment properties, it's a little unique because it's outside of BC. So we definitely have property managers involved because we're not physically there.
Where's your property?
In Las Vegas.
Vegas.
Yeah. No glitz and glamour, guys. Don't get it twisted. Very, humble homes in Las Vegas. But part of that was the screening. It was really hard because we started out in smaller homes, and then we just consolidated, sold both, and bought a bigger one in a nicer neighborhood. But with those older, smaller homes, it was kind of in a rougher part of the woods, which, we were looking at dollars. And tenant screening for that was really tough. I could only imagine if we were to do that on our own, that would have been really difficult. You're dealing with applicants who are coming in who can't really show employment history, who don't have great credit scores. Like, they're nice people, and you're like, I would love to house you, but I'm also thinking about my investment and my long-term decision making here. And so not really nightmare situation, but we did have a client who, I also wouldn't say nightmare situation. It was just a little unfortunate, where they sort of had squatters in their family home.
Oh, wow.
And so that took almost a year to sort. And it did involve the sheriff and the squatters being escorted out. I'm not too familiar with like the squatter rights in Vancouver because thankfully I've never had to deal with it before.
Yeah.
But that's probably the most, I would say, negative experience that I've heard.
Sure. So I'm curious about this, like obviously investing in Vegas. Do you know, like, was it tough to find, like, did you get lots of applicants? Do you know, like, vacancy rate-ish, or just like how many applicants did you get? And
see,
like,
this is where
find?
I would phone a friend and call my property manager.
Mm-hmm.
But again, this is one of those things where we just said, hey, we've got this capital. We want to invest it somewhere. Our minimum number is this. Where can we get it? And a realtor working with the property manager that we had, we're like, okay, here, 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 and here. This is your purchase price. This is your rent. This is a good number. But even then, we had it vacant we closed escrow in September. We only got a tenant in the beginning of February.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, but we were 100% cash purchase. So at least the carrying costs were just the HOA fees, which are the strata fees in the States. And then like garbage, water, like some monthly property tax. So it wasn't that big. But for somebody who's buying that with a little bit of a mortgage, that's quite a long time to have a carrying cost with no income.
For sure. Can I ask, what made you decide to invest in the U.S. versus, say, here in Canada in our own backyard?
Well, my situation's a little unique. So I don't know if you know this, but I was born in LA.
That's right.
Yeah,
I
so
do know this. Yeah.
I'm a dual citizen. My parents are Canadian, but they do have roots in the States. My mom's side of the family is still all there. So having that US dollar cash flow was important to them as far as leaving open the future of whether or not they want to retire here or in Los Angeles or maybe in Vegas, who knows. But so just keeping those options open for them.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Gotcha.
And it wasn't really too much about anything else. Also, besides the fact that all our equity here is tied up in other properties.
Wow, look at that. That's awesome.
So, yeah. What about you? All your investment properties are here in Vancouver?
Everything here locally. I have a couple pre-sales coming, one in Vancouver, one in Kelowna as well. I'm very thankful.
Oh, Kelowna. That'll be a fun one.
It will. So when I was purchasing the Kelowna one, I was deciding between short-term rental and whether to go for a long-term type of a property.
Did you get in before the Airbnb
So
changes?
here's what happened. So I was deciding between two projects, one of them zoned for short-term, one of them zoned for long-term. And long story short, if you haven't been keeping up, they've changed the short-term legislation. So even the building that was selling for short-term rentals is going to be restricted, only long-term. And the value of a one bed between both of these buildings, you paid about 50 to 60 grand more to be in the short-term rental building because you were going to get more revenue. So I was making this decision a couple years back, and I decided to go with the lower cost that restricted short-term rentals to go with a long-term tenant. There's a new UBC getting built there, so I figured go long-term. But the big reason I did that was the forest fires were scaring the heck out of me.
Yes.
Because I was thinking, okay, if I have a summer where no one comes to visit my property, I'm going to have to feed it all year. And short-term rental, like you make all your money during certain
the peak seasons. Yeah.
Certain seasons. So I was like, you know what? Let's go long-term. Our revenue will be lower. We'll be married to the tenant. That's okay. I'm so glad I did that because now, we have these instances where, people paid premium for units. And some of these units as well, they're quite small. They're kind of designed for that short-term rental investor.
Yeah.
Someone who's in there long-term is not going to want it.
No.
So this is going to cause, as this legislation plays out after May, it's going to cause a lot of issues for like these micro units.
Yeah.
Right. So
that are basically hotel rooms.
Yeah, they're basically hotel rooms. And that's something, if you're going to get into a rental condo and you're maybe thinking, okay, well, I'm going to invest it in an area that doesn't have short-term legislation, you should always do a plan B
for just in case,
for long-term.
Yeah.
And that's what I tell my clients all the time. Even if you're looking at a short-term rental scenario, let's create a second tab and let's do the long-term scenario.
Yeah.
And if you're happy with the long-term scenario, then you can go ahead and buy it.
Yeah.
Pull the trigger, go with the A plan, and worst case, go with the B plan.
Yeah.
But you'll never get past the legislation. I don't know if you get calls that are like, I get calls that are like, how do I get around that legislation? What do I got to do? I'm like, I don't know. Like this is law. Like I value my license, but you know what I mean? So you'll never get around the legislation. You got to work with it to your best ability. And you have to make the long-term decision when it comes to rental investing and realize that you're purchasing it not just for you now, but very likely and very often for future generations. 100%. I don't know about you, but I have lots of clients that they're buying a condo for their child who's like 6 or 7 years old. They're going to go to university later and they want to have something for them.
They're looking at it like a forced savings account.
Yeah.
So on that note, as far as making those decisions, having those long-term goals, the legwork that goes into buying an investment property, is the juice worth the squeeze?
I absolutely think so. I think for 80% of people, it's 100% worth it. Just what you mentioned in terms of the forced savings account, like making it an investment that, you basically have no choice. Like once you're in there, you're very unlikely to move off of it. And, all the great investors will tell you that they've made their money through long-term investing.
Yep.
Right. Long horizons. Like you look at Warren Buffett and he didn't have a ton of money to start. Obviously he has a ton now, but it's all been long-term investing, right? He doesn't pull out of markets. And I have a lot of clients that have rental condos. I have a couple of clients that have like double digit and not low double digit, but rental condos. And they're just like, I'm not going to sell. I'm going to hold on to them. And so for most people as a first step, I say yes, it's tangible, it's real estate, you can touch it.
Yeah.
If you need to move into it, you can move into it. You have, multiple uses with that asset. For me, it's a no-brainer.
Yeah.
How about yourself? What do you think?
I agree. And especially in Metro Vancouver, where we do have that lack of supply, so the demand is always going to outweigh it. You're always going to be on the positive end of things when you're playing the long game, for sure. So if you've got that right mindset, the work that needs to be put into it, the patience and the determination to really see it through to your long-term goals, 100% the juice is worth the squeeze.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Well, as we wrap up this episode, Michelle, how can people find you online, your socials?
Instagram, mlegaspi_Vancouver. You can also find me through my team's page at West Coast Living Real Estate.
Awesome. And you can find me on Instagram, TikTok at Hasan Juma, also on YouTube, Vancouver Real Estate with Hasan. But yeah, we want to thank you for checking out episode 2. We look forward to seeing you in episode 3.
Yeah. Any comments, suggestions, topics that you guys want us to discuss in upcoming episodes, give us a shout.
Yeah. And all our contact info is in the show notes as well.
Yeah.
Cheers. Thanks.
Thank you.